The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. Silas Boone was standing at the depot window when the station master handed it to him, folded once with his name written across the front in that cramped, hurried script that never meant anything good. He'd been waiting 3 hours by then, watching the road south like a man who had nothing better to do, which was a lie he'd been telling himself all morning. He had plenty to do. The east fence needed mending. The water trough near the barn had sprung a crack. 2 of his mares were due to foal before the month was out. But none of that had mattered since 6 o'clock in the morning, when he'd hitched the wagon and driven into town with Maggie sitting beside him in her good dress, the one she'd saved without being asked. He opened the telegram slowly. Stagecoach carrying passengers from Cheyenne reported overturned near Soldier Creek Crossing, mile marker 41, Badlands route. Survivor status unknown. Search party dispatched. Advise next of kin. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and stood very still for a moment, looking at the road again. "Papa?" He turned. Maggie was 8 years old and small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and the particular kind of stillness that children develop when they've spent too much time around grief. She was standing beside the wagon with her hands folded in front of her, watching him with that look she had, not scared exactly, but careful, like she was trying to decide something. "Is it about the lady?" she asked. He walked over and crouched down in front of her. He didn't know how to soften it, and he'd never believed in lying to children, so he told her the truth the only way he knew how, which was directly. "There was an accident with the stagecoach," he said. "She might not be coming today." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "Is she dead?" "I don't know. But she might be." "Yes." She looked down at her folded hands. She was wearing white gloves that she'd asked Mrs. Callahan at the dry goods store to help her clean 2 days ago, because she'd wanted everything to be right. Silas felt that detail like a splinter working itself deeper. "All right," Maggie said finally, in that small, controlled voice that shouldn't have belonged to an 8-year-old. "What do we do?" He stood up and put his hand on her shoulder and looked south down the road, toward the Badlands, toward the 40 miles of broken rock and canyon and heat that sat between this town and where that telegram had originated. "We're going to find her," he said. He said it before he'd fully decided it, but once the words were out, something settled in his chest. Not peace, exactly. More like the particular kind of quiet that comes after you stop arguing with yourself about something. He looked down at his daughter. She was looking back up at him with something that wasn't quite hope, but was maybe the shape hope leaves behind when it's been disappointed before. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you to Mrs. Callahan's." The town of Harlan Creek had opinions about most things, and it formed one about Silas Boone's plan within approximately 40 minutes of his arrival at the livery stable to ask about provisions for a 2-day ride south. He heard about it in pieces, the way you always do in small towns. A comment from the stable hand about the roads being washed out past the gorge. A knowing look from the man filling canteens at the well. A direct intervention from Franklin Ware, who ran the hardware store and considered himself the voice of practical reason in most situations. "Silas," Franklin appeared at his elbow while he was checking his saddle cinch. "You heard about the accident?" "I did. Search party's already gone out from the garrison at Millsford. Army men. They know those roads." "Good. Then they'll already have a head start when I leave." Franklin was quiet for a moment. He was a deliberate man, not unkind, and he chose his next words with the care of someone who knew he was about to say something unwelcome. "The woman's been on that route 4 days, Silas, in June, in the Badlands." Silas finished checking the cinch. "I'm aware of the calendar, Franklin. I'm not trying to be cruel about it. I'm just saying that the math on survival out there, I know the math." He straightened and looked at the older man. "She wrote to me every week for 4 months, every single week on time, without fail. She wrote about what she was leaving behind and what she hoped to find here. She wrote about Maggie like she already knew her." He paused. "She promised she was coming. She's not the kind of woman who breaks a promise because things got hard." Franklin looked at him for a long moment. "You've never met her?" "No," Silas said, "but I know her." He swung up into the saddle. Franklin stepped back, and there was something on his face that wasn't quite pity, but lived in the same neighborhood. That expression people put on when they've said their piece and know they're going to be proven right and take no pleasure in it. Silas didn't wait for more. He turned his horse south and rode out of Harlan Creek with 2 days' worth of water, a medical kit that he'd bought the last of from the doctor's shelf, and 23 letters in his saddlebag that he'd read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Her name was Vivian Mercer. He knew the shape of her from her letters before he knew her face. She was 31 years old, had spent the last 6 years working as a seamstress in a tailoring house in St. Louis, and she was, by her own admission in the very first letter she'd ever sent him, not a romantic. "I want to be honest with you from the start, Mr. Boone," she had written in that precise, slightly formal hand that he'd come to associate so completely with her voice. "I am not writing because I believe in fairy stories or because I have romantic notions about frontier life. I'm writing because I am a practical woman in a practical situation, and your advertisement suggested you might be the same kind of person. I have no family left to speak of. I have skills that would be useful on a working ranch. I am not afraid of hard work, and I don't expect things to be easy. If that sounds like someone you could build a life with, then perhaps we have something to discuss." He had laughed out loud reading that first letter, alone in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night after Maggie was in bed. He hadn't laughed like that in a long time. He'd written back the same night. Over the months that followed, the letters changed. Not dramatically. Vivian wasn't a dramatic person by nature, or at least she didn't present herself as one. But there was a loosening, a gradual dropping of the formal distance she'd kept in those early letters, a willingness to say things that weren't strictly practical. She wrote about missing the sound of rain on a roof when she was alone. She wrote about a book she'd read 3 times because she couldn't afford to buy a new one. She wrote about Maggie, about how Silas described her, about the things she imagined she might be like, with a careful tenderness that struck him every time because she never oversold it. She never said, "I can't wait to be her mother," or anything like that. She said things like, "She sounds like someone who has learned to take care of herself." Those children are often harder to reach, but it means more when you do. He thought about that sentence a lot, riding south through the dust. She had traveled from St. Louis to Cheyenne by rail and from Cheyenne south and west by stagecoach, a route that cut through some of the roughest terrain in Wyoming territory because it was faster than going around. That had been her choice. He'd suggested the longer route in his last letter. She'd written back that she didn't see the point in adding 3 extra days of travel to avoid roads that were merely inconvenient rather than genuinely impassable. He'd found that answer completely characteristic of her. He wondered now, riding into the heat, whether she'd second-guessed that choice in the hours after the crash. The search party from Millsford had left tracks that he could follow for the first 12 miles, a trail of boot prints and hoof marks in the dust heading generally southwest. Then the terrain shifted. Limestone shelves, rock faces, ground that didn't hold impressions, and he was on his own. He made camp the first night at the edge of a shallow gorge, ate cold beans from a tin, and read 2 of her letters by firelight because he couldn't sleep and because reading them felt, strangely, like a form of discipline, a way of keeping the purpose in front of him rather than the fear. The last letter she'd sent was dated 3 weeks earlier, written just before she'd left St. Louis for good. "I find I'm not as afraid as I expected to be," she had written. "That surprises me. I've spent most of my life being afraid of something, of not having enough, of being too much trouble, of taking up space that wasn't offered to me freely. But when I think about Wyoming, about the ranch, about you and your daughter, I feel something different. I don't have a clean word for it. It's not bravery, it's more like, I've decided. And once you've decided, fear becomes less important than the direction you're moving. I will be there, Mr. Boone. You have my word on it." He folded the letter and held it in his hand for a while. "You have my word on it." He looked at the dark sky, the particular thick black of night in open country with no lamp anywhere on the horizon. "All right," he said quietly to no one. "I'm coming." He found the stagecoach on the afternoon of the second day. He smelled it first, a faint char on the air, wood and leather that had burned and gone cold, mixed with the heavier smell of animal. He came around a limestone outcropping and pulled his horse up short, and what he was looking at took a moment to process. The coach had gone off the road at a curve where the ground dropped away sharply to the left, a fall of maybe 30 feet into the canyon floor. The vehicle was on its side, one wheel still attached and pointing upward at an angle, the rest of it broken open like a split crate. The horses, all 4 of them, were dead, still tangled in the rigging. Something had been at the carcasses. He looked away from that and concentrated on the wreck itself. 3 days, the sun had been at this. Everything that could shrink had shrunk. The interior of the coach was exposed to the sky, the door hanging open and swinging slightly in the dry wind like a broken jaw. He worked his way down the canyon slope on foot, holding his horse's lead, and went through what was left with methodical care because he didn't let himself think about what he was going to find or not find. He checked every corner of the wreck and the ground around it. He found 2 trunks that had burst open, clothing scattered and sun-bleached. He found a man's boot. He found a leather satchel that the Army search party had apparently missed or discarded, half buried under a piece of collapsed roofing. He found no bodies. He stood in the middle of the wreck and turned in a slow circle. The search party had gone west toward Millsford. He could see their tracks on the canyon floor, heading out along the dry creek bed in an organized line. They had searched the immediate area and moved on, carrying whatever or whoever they had found. But the Army search party had been looking for bodies, or for people who could stand up and wave. He thought about the letters, about a woman who described herself as not afraid of hard work and didn't see the point in waiting when she could move. He thought about someone who had decided, and for whom that decision made fear less important than direction. He looked north and east along the canyon floor, the opposite direction from where the Army had gone. There were marks in the dust. Faint, scraped and uneven, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it, if you were looking for footprints instead of the drag marks left by someone who couldn't walk. He followed them. The canyon ran northeast for almost 2 miles before it widened into a shallow basin where a band of shade fell from the eastern wall in the late afternoon. He tracked the drag marks the whole way, losing them twice on rock and finding them again in softer ground. They were consistent. That was the thing that kept him moving when his water was low and his horse was beginning to stumble. The marks were consistent. She hadn't been going in circles. She hadn't been wandering. She'd been moving in a direction, deliberately, like someone with a plan. He found her under a rock overhang at the edge of the basin, in 6 inches of shade, wedged against the canyon wall. She was alive. He almost walked past her. She was so still, so sun-darkened, pressed so flat against the rock that for one terrible second he thought he'd found another piece of wreckage. Then he saw her hand, the fingers twitching slightly, reflexive, like someone fighting off a dream. He dropped to his knees. "Vivian." His voice came out rougher than he intended. He'd planned to be calm about this, controlled, the way you were when you found injured livestock and needed to keep your own nerves out of the equation. That plan didn't survive the first sight of her. She was wearing what had been a blue traveling dress, now reduced to something filthy and torn. Both of her legs were clearly wrong, the left one worse than the right, bent in a way that made him go very still on the inside while he kept his hands and voice level. Her lips were cracked through to bleeding. Her face was burned and peeling across the cheekbones and nose, and there was a wound on her left temple, scabbed over but deep. He got his canteen open and held it near her mouth, not touching her head yet because he didn't know what other injuries she had. "Vivian," he said her name again, steadier this time. "My name is Silas Boone. I came to find you." Her eyes opened. They were gray. He hadn't known that. She'd never mentioned it, and it wasn't the kind of thing you described in a letter. Gray and very direct, even in the state she was in, even clearly struggling to focus. She looked at him for a long moment with the particular concentration of someone fighting through a fog to understand what they were seeing. Then she said, in a voice that was barely a sound, "You're late." He laughed. He didn't mean to. It just came out of him the same way it had with that very first letter, unexpected and entirely genuine. "I had to wait for the telegram," he said. "Drink." She drank. He let her have small amounts, controlled, watching how she swallowed. She was dehydrated past the point where you gave someone all the water they wanted, and he knew it, and she didn't fight him on rationing, which told him something about her even now. She drank what he gave her and then lay back against the rock and closed her eyes. "My legs," she said. "I can see. I'm going to check them before we move. Both broken." Her voice was toneless, reporting information. "The left one worse. I felt it when it happened, and I've had some time to consider it since." A pause. "I've been dragging myself. I didn't know how far the road was, but I thought north, or northeast, I wasn't sure." Northeast, he said. You were right. She was quiet for a moment. I counted days. I made marks on the rock. She opened her eyes, and he followed where she was looking to the overhang above her where 4 scratched lines ran in a row. 4 days. I kept thinking, if I stop moving, no one will know where to look. He started examining her legs carefully, his hands as steady as he could make them. The left was bad. The bone hadn't broken through the skin, but it had moved, and getting her out of here and back 40 miles without compounding the damage was going to require things he didn't have: a proper stretcher, a wagon, a doctor. He had rope, a bedroll, and a horse, and he was going to have to figure out the rest. Did anyone else survive? He asked, because he needed to know, and because she needed something to focus on besides what his hands were finding. I don't know. There were 6 passengers. I was at the back of the coach. When it went over, I hit the door frame. She paused, deciding something. When I came to, I was on the canyon floor. I called out. There was no answer. I couldn't see much. It was dark by then. I waited until morning, and then I started moving. Alone, with 2 broken legs. I had a choice between waiting to die in the shade of a wrecked coach or trying to reach the road, she said, with a flat matter-of-factness that was somehow more striking than if she'd said it dramatically. I've never been very good at waiting. He sat back and looked at her directly for the first time since he'd crouched down. She met his eyes without flinching, though it clearly cost her. I'm going to get you out, he said. It's going to be hard and it's going to hurt. I'm going to need you to tell me when something I'm doing is making it worse, but I also need you not to quit. She looked at him for a moment. Mr. Boone, she said, I dragged myself 2 miles across rock and sand on my arms alone. I'm not going to quit now because of a horse ride. He nodded. All right. How far is it? 40 miles to Harlan Creek. She absorbed that. And your daughter? She's safe. He blinked. Of all the things she might have asked. She's with a neighbor in town. She's fine. Something shifted in Vivian's face, not relief exactly, but the settling of a weight she'd been carrying. Good, she said. That's good. Getting her onto the horse took the better part of an hour. He had no good way to do it. She was taller than he'd expected, most of 5.5 feet, and the dead weight of 2 broken legs made every movement a negotiation against gravity and pain. He improvised a brace for the left leg using pieces of a broken wagon spoke he'd salvaged from the wreck site and strips torn from the bedroll, and he did it methodically, explaining everything he was doing before he did it, because he'd found that people in pain managed it better when they weren't surprised. She didn't cry. She made sounds, short, controlled, involuntary. But she didn't cry, and when he apologized for hurting her, she said through her teeth, "Don't apologize. It's not your fault. Just keep going." He did. He seated her sideways across the saddle and arranged her weight as carefully as he could, bracing her against his chest when he mounted behind her, one arm across her middle to hold her in place. She was rigid with the effort of managing the pain, every muscle in her body tight. "Tell me if you need to stop," he said. "Tell me when we're there," she said. He nudged the horse forward, and they began. The first hour was the worst. The canyon floor was uneven, cut with shallow, dry watercourses and patches of loose stone that made the horse step carefully and shift its weight, every movement a minor violence transmitted up through the saddle. Vivian said nothing for most of it. He could feel her breathing change, sharp and quick and controlled, whenever the horse hit rough ground, and he held her tighter and picked the smoothest line he could find through the terrain. Once in the second hour, she spoke. "Talk to me," she said. Her voice was strained but clear. "What about?" "Anything. Tell me about the ranch." So he did. He told her about the land first, the way it laid between 2 long ridges that caught the morning light, the creek that ran through the southeast corner and kept water even in dry summers, the east meadow where he'd been planning to expand the herd. He told her about the house, that it was small but well built, that the kitchen was the biggest room because the original owner had understood something about what a kitchen meant to a working household, that there were 2 rooms upstairs that caught the wind from the north in summer. He told her about the barn and the horses by name and the peculiar genius of a cattle dog he'd had for 6 years named Porter, who had recently and catastrophically decided that the chickens were also his to manage. She laughed at that last one. It was a small sound, barely more than an exhale, but it was real. "And Maggie," she said. "Tell me about Maggie." He was quiet for a moment. He'd written about Maggie many times, but talking about her was different. "She's 8, he said. "She's careful. She doesn't give things away easily. Her mother died 2 years ago, and she's been the one holding things together here in ways that an 8-year-old shouldn't have to be." He paused. "She cleaned her white gloves to meet you. She didn't tell me she did it. I just noticed." Vivian was silent for a moment. "That's a child who wants to be loved," she said finally, very quietly, "but has learned not to ask for it." He didn't answer that because there wasn't anything to add. They rode on. He made camp when the light went, because the horse was exhausted and because Vivian's color had gone wrong, too pale under the sunburn, lips pressed thin. He got her off the horse with less grace than the mounting had required because his own arms were burning with fatigue, and he laid her as flat as he could on the bedroll and gave her water and the last of a tin of beef he'd packed. She ate mechanically, small amounts, like someone who understood nutrition as function rather than pleasure. Then she lay still, looking at the stars. "You came alone," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He thought about how to answer that. "Because a search party would have given up by now," he said finally. "And I had your letters." She turned her head and looked at him across the small fire. "I want you to know," she said, "that I understand this doesn't—" She paused, choosing words with the same precision she used in her writing. "It doesn't oblige you to anything. If I recover and can't walk properly, if I'm not what you expected, you're entitled to eat." "Stop," he said. She stopped. "I didn't ride 40 miles into the Badlands to be entitled to something," he said. "I came because you said you were coming, and I believe you're the kind of person who keeps her word. That's a rare thing, and I don't plan to waste it." She looked at him for a long time. "You're not what I expected either," she said at last. "Is that good or bad?" "I don't know yet." But something in her face had shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened a little, the way a door opens when someone finally tries the handle. "Ask me again when I can stand up." He almost smiled. Fair enough. He fed the fire and made sure she was as comfortable as she could be made, and then sat awake for a long while after she slept, listening to her breathing and to the sound of the night around them, and thinking about the 40 miles still between them and home, and the woman his daughter had cleaned her white gloves for, and the way Vivian Mercer had dragged herself 2 miles across stone rather than break a promise to people she hadn't yet met. Outside, the Wyoming dark was enormous and indifferent, the stars very far away and very numerous, and the wind moved through the canyon like it moved through everywhere out here, without asking, without stopping, entirely itself. He fed another branch to the fire and watched the sparks rise. She was alive. She was here. The rest of it, the broken legs, the 40 miles, the work ahead, all of that was just the next problem in a long line of problems. And he had learned over years of working land that didn't care about his plans, that problems didn't diminish when you stared at them, and they didn't grow when you looked away. You just handled what was in front of you, 1 mile at a time. He looked at her sleeping face, still tight, even in sleep, as if her body didn't quite trust unconsciousness. And he thought about the first letter she'd ever sent him, about a practical woman in a practical situation, about not believing in fairy stories. He didn't believe in them either. He believed in the 40 miles ahead of them, and the ranch beyond it, and the daughter who had cleaned her white gloves and said, "What do we do with more steadiness than most adults could manage?" And he believed in the particular quiet way of someone who has arrived at a thing slowly rather than all at once, that he had found something worth carrying home. He woke her before dawn. "We need to move while it's cool," he said. She came awake quickly, without the confused thrashing of someone disoriented, fully present from the first breath, which told him she'd been sleeping light. "All right," she said, and immediately began the process of sitting up, doing it herself, her jaw tight. He helped her without commenting on the help, and she accepted it without commenting on the acceptance. Something in that small exchange felt like a negotiation they'd both already agreed to without needing to discuss it. He lifted her back onto the horse, She had the brace adjusted wrong and told him so, and they fixed it together, her hands and his, in the gray pre-dawn light. Then he mounted behind her, and they turned north toward Harlan Creek, toward a little girl in white gloves who had asked, "What do we do?" and had meant it. 40 miles, one at a time. He pointed the horse toward home. The second morning in the canyon was colder than the first. Not cold enough to matter, not by Wyoming standards, but cold enough that Vivian's body had stiffened overnight in ways that made the first hour of riding a particular kind of punishment. She didn't say so. He knew it from the way she held herself, that rigid, deliberate stillness of someone who has decided that if they don't move much, the pain won't either, which was never true, but was sometimes the only strategy available. He kept the horse to the smoothest ground he could find and didn't talk much, because she hadn't asked him to talk, and he'd learned enough about her in the past 24 hours to understand that Vivian Mercer did not require noise to fill silence. She sat against his chest with her injured legs braced across the saddle and her eyes fixed on the terrain ahead, reading it the way he did, looking for the line through, the path of least resistance, the place where the ground was most likely to hold. Around mid-morning, she spoke. "How did you find me?" she said. "The specific location." "The army went west." "You left drag marks." A pause. "I didn't realize I was leaving marks." "You were moving consistently, same direction, same effort. Anyone looking for footprints would have missed it." He shifted his grip on the reins. "I wasn't looking for footprints." She thought about that. "What were you looking for?" "Where you'd go," he said, "based on the letters." Another silence, longer this time. The horse picked its way around a shallow wash in the canyon floor, stepping down carefully and up the other side, and Vivian absorbed the movement without sound, though he could feel her hands tighten briefly on the saddle horn. "You used my letters to track me," she said finally. Not quite a question. "You wrote once that when you didn't know the right answer, you moved toward what you could estimate rather than staying still for the perfect information. I figured you'd head the direction that made the most sense with what you knew, not the direction that felt safe." She was quiet for so long that he started to think she wasn't going to answer. "That's a very strange way to find a person," she said at last. "It worked. It did." Something in her voice shifted. Not warmth exactly, but its possibility. "Most people would have waited for the Army's report. Most people weren't the ones you were coming to meet." She didn't have an answer for that. He hadn't expected one. They rode on through the warming morning, the canyon walls climbing on either side, the sky above them a hard, pale blue with no clouds and no mercy. They were out of the canyon by noon and onto open ground, which should have been easier and wasn't. Open ground meant sun without interruption, and the temperature came up fast. He stopped twice to water the horse and make Vivian drink more than she wanted to, and the second time she pushed the canteen back at him with something that wasn't quite irritation but was its cousin. "I'm not going to evaporate," she said. "You're already dehydrated. Drink the water, Vivian." She drank the water, but she looked at him with an expression that made it clear she was drinking it on her own terms. He was beginning to understand that this was how she operated, that compliance and surrender were entirely different things to her. And she would do what needed doing, but she would do it as herself, not as someone who had been managed into it. He found he didn't mind. It was in fact considerably easier to handle than the alternative. He'd known people who went soft in a crisis, who needed to be constantly reassured and directed, and it was exhausting work. Vivian didn't need reassurance. She needed honest information and room to make her own decisions with it. "The left leg," he said, while she recapped the canteen. "How bad is the pain right now?" She considered the question with the seriousness she seemed to give all questions. "Constant," she said, "but manageable. It was worse this morning. Moving helps, actually. When it's still, the muscles seize up around it. The brace isn't right." "It's better than nothing." She looked down at the improvised splint, the wagon spoke and the strips of bedroll. "You did well with what you had. The doctor in Harlan Creek is going to need to reset it properly. That's going to be unpleasant," she finished, in the tone of someone checking a box. "Yes, I've thought about that." She paused. "Is he a competent doctor?" "Amos Beckett. He's the only doctor within 60 miles, so competence is relative." "That's not encouraging." "He set a broken arm for Maggie last winter when she fell out of the loft. She healed clean. He's careful." Vivian nodded slowly. He could see her doing the same thing she'd done in the canyon, taking the available information and building a workable picture from it, not a comfortable one, just an accurate one. "All right," she said. "Let's keep moving." They reached the edge of his property line at dusk on the second day, which was both later and earlier than he'd feared. Later, because the horse had tired badly in the afternoon heat, and they'd lost an hour at a rocky creek crossing where he'd had to dismount and lead. Earlier, because Vivian had not once asked to stop beyond the watering breaks he'd insisted on. He knew they'd crossed onto his land before he could see any landmarks because the grass changed. His east pasture ran a particular mix of native grasses that he'd spent 3 years nursing along, and the texture of it underfoot was as familiar to him as the sound of his own name. He felt the horse recognize it too, the subtle quickening in the animal's step. "This is the ranch," he said. Vivian had been quiet for the past 2 hours, conserving everything for the endurance of it, but she lifted her head at that. "How much further to the house?" "Half a mile." She exhaled slowly. Not relief, more like a calculation completed. "And Maggie's still at the neighbor's?" "I'll send word when we arrive. She can come in the morning." He paused. "I didn't want her to—" He stopped. "See me like this?" Vivian said, without judgment or self-pity. Stating it. "I wanted to give you a day," he said carefully, "to get settled before Silas." She said his first name, and it was the first time she had, and they both noticed it. "I'm not fragile. I understand the instinct, but please don't manage the situation on my behalf. If she wants to come tonight, let her come." He thought about Maggie, about that careful, watchful face and the white gloves folded in her lap at the depot. "She'll want to come tonight," he said. "Then let her." A pause. "I've been lying in a canyon thinking about meeting her for 4 days. I'm not going to fall apart because I'm not presentable." Dr. Beckett arrived at the ranch within the hour of Silas sending the stable hand into town, which said something about the man. Either he'd been waiting for news or he slept fully dressed, and neither possibility was entirely implausible. He came through the door with his bag already open and his sleeves already rolled, took one look at Vivian laid out on the kitchen table, the largest flat surface in the house, which was the practical choice, and she had agreed to it without being asked, and said, "How long ago did this happen?" 4 days, Vivian said. Beckett looked at Silas with an expression that meant several things simultaneously. Silas had known the man long enough to translate. She walked out of there on her own? "I didn't walk," Vivian said without looking away from the ceiling. "I dragged. There's a difference." Beckett cleared his throat and began his examination. He was not a man who wasted words during medical work. He used them the way he used instruments for specific purposes. But partway through his assessment of the left leg, he paused. "I'm going to have to manipulate this," he said. "The bone has started to set in the wrong position. We need to correct it before it gets much further." "I know," Vivian said. "It's going to hurt considerably." "Dr. Beckett." She turned her head and looked at him with the same direct gray eyes that had looked at Silas across the firelight 2 nights ago. "I have spent 4 days in the Badlands in June with 2 broken legs and no water. I am aware that this is going to hurt. Please proceed." Beckett looked at her for a moment with something that was definitely respect, even if he was too contained a man to say so directly. Then he looked at Silas and said, "Hold her." Silas came around to the head of the table and put his hands on Vivian's shoulders, not restraining so much as anchoring, and she reached up without hesitation and gripped his forearm with both hands, and he felt her fingers close with a strength that surprised him. Not desperate, not panicked, just deliberate. Like someone taking hold of something solid before a storm. Beckett worked quickly. Vivian made a sound that he would not repeat, and her grip on his arm went from deliberate to crushing for about 45 seconds, and then it released by degrees as Beckett stepped back. "Done," Beckett said. "The left one's set. The right is cleaner. Shouldn't need correction, just immobilization." Vivian lay still for a moment, breathing. "Thank you," she said to the ceiling. Her voice was steady, then, "How long before I can walk?" Beckett began the business of proper splinting. "Months. The left leg especially. You need to stay off it completely for the first 6 weeks. After that, we'll see." "I can't stay off it completely. There's work." "Vivian." Silas said it quietly. She turned her head and looked at him. Her face was pale with pain and fatigue, but her eyes were sharp, and there was a debate happening behind them. The practical woman calculating against the part of her that had agreed to follow someone else's lead on occasion. 6 weeks, he said. Then we see. A pause. A long one. All right, she said. 6 weeks. Maggie arrived at 8:30. Silas heard the wagon before he saw it. Mrs. Callahan had apparently not waited to be sent for a second time, and had brought the girl herself the moment word reached town that Silas was back. He went out to meet them in the yard, and Maggie came off the wagon seat before it had fully stopped, which was unusual for her. She was generally a careful child, deliberate in her movements, and she crossed the yard at something between a walk and a run, her white gloves still on, which he noticed and which made something catch in his chest. She stopped in front of him and looked up. "Is she here?" she asked. "She's here. She's in the kitchen with Dr. Beckett." Maggie's face moved through something complicated that she didn't fully let surface. "Is she—" She stopped, started again. "Is she going to be all right?" He crouched down in front of her, same as he had at the depot 2 days ago. "The doctor thinks so. She's hurt, Maggie. Both her legs are broken. She's going to need help for a while." Maggie absorbed this. "What kind of help?" "All kinds. Help getting around, help with things she can't reach. Company." He looked at his daughter. "She's been alone for 4 days in the Badlands. She's strong, but she'll need people," Maggie said simply. "Yes." The girl looked past him toward the house. The kitchen window was lit warm yellow against the dark. "Can I go in?" she asked. "She asked me to let you come tonight," he said. "So yes." Maggie straightened her gloves, an unconscious gesture adjusting them at the wrist, and walked toward the house with the quiet, collected dignity of a child who has decided that this matters enough to do carefully. He watched her go, then stood and nodded to Mrs. Callahan, who gave him a look that contained considerable information about what the town had been saying in his absence, and then flicked her eyes toward the house with something warmer. "Bring her to see me when she's up for it," the woman said, and drove away. He came into the kitchen in time to see Maggie standing in the doorway, stopped there, looking at Vivian laid out on the kitchen table with her legs splinted and her face still bearing the evidence of 4 days in the sun. Vivian looked back at her. Beckett was in the corner packing his bag and making himself as unobtrusive as a man of his size could manage. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Maggie said, very carefully, "You look different than I imagined." "I expect I do," Vivian said. "I've had a difficult week. This is not my best presentation." Maggie considered this seriously. "Your hair is the same color as in the drawing you sent," she said. "I kept the drawing." Something crossed Vivian's face, an emotion she didn't immediately categorize, too quick to name. "You kept it." "In my room, on the wall by the window." A pause, then, with the directness of children. "Does it hurt very much?" "Yes," Vivian said, "but less than it did this morning." Maggie nodded, considering that answer with the same gravity she gave everything. Then she walked into the kitchen, pulled a chair to the side of the table, and sat down. She still had her white gloves on. "I can read to you," she said, "if that helps. Sometimes when I was sick, having someone read helped." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. Her jaw was tight, not in pain, or not only in pain. "I would like that very much," she said quietly. Maggie slid off the chair and went to the parlor for a book. She came back with one, a worn copy of a collection of stories that Silas recognized as her mother's, and climbed back into the chair and opened it and began to read in a clear, careful voice, the voice she used when she was doing something that mattered. Silas stood in the doorway and watched his daughter read to the woman he'd found in the desert. And he didn't go in, and he didn't speak, because some things don't need to be interrupted. Beckett caught him on the porch on his way out. "She should have been dead," the doctor said, not dramatically, just as fact. 4 days out there, injuries like that. No water for the first 2, minimum. She shouldn't be alive. "I know. She's going to have a long recovery. The left leg—" He paused, recalibrating to something more careful. "I want to be honest with you. It may not heal completely. There's some question about whether the bone set incorrectly in the field for long enough to—" He stopped again. "She may walk with a limp, Permanently. We won't know for months. Silas leaned against the porch post and looked out at the dark ranch. He could hear Maggie's voice inside, thin and clear through the window, reading. Does she know? I told her, she said. Beckett paused, and for the first time a corner of his professional restraint slipped, something almost like wonder coming through. She said, All right, we'll see what we're working with when the time comes. Silas almost smiled. That sounds right. You found her in a canyon 2 miles from the crash site, Beckett said. She'd been moving toward the road. Yes. On her arms for 4 days. Yes. The doctor was quiet for a moment, looking out at the same dark Silas was looking at. I've been practicing medicine for 22 years, he said. I want you to understand that what you're telling me is not normal. What that woman did out there is not something most people do. Most people... He stopped himself. Most people choose differently when the situation is that extreme. She made a promise, Silas said. Beckett looked at him. She told me she was coming, Silas said simply. She doesn't break promises. The doctor picked up his bag and stepped off the porch into the night. Then he paused at the bottom step and looked back. Take care of her, he said. The next few weeks are going to be the real battle. He slept in the chair in the kitchen that first night, unwilling to be further than a room away in case she needed something and too practical to pretend it was for any other reason. He woke twice, once when she shifted and inhaled sharply, the pain catching her in sleep, and he was up and beside her before he was fully conscious, and she blinked at him and said, I'm fine, go back to sleep, which he almost believed. The second time he woke on his own, some internal alarm tripped by years of ranch work, and he fed the stove and sat back down and watched the light change slowly in the east window. She was awake too. He could tell from her breathing. You don't have to watch me, she said to the ceiling. I'm not watching you. I'm sitting in the kitchen. In a chair 3 feet from this table. It's a small kitchen. A pause. Then, and he wasn't sure she intended him to hear it. It was so quiet. Something that might have been a laugh, barely voiced, there and gone. Silas. Thank you. She said it plainly, without qualifier or reduction. For coming. He didn't make a production of it. You're welcome. The stove ticked. Outside, something moved in the yard. One of the horses, shifting in the dark. I've been thinking, she said, about what happens next. You've been awake for... I've been thinking about it for 4 days. I have a lot of thoughts saved up. Her voice was dry. When I can move, I want to be useful. I understand I'm going to be limited for a while, but I can still... There are things I can do sitting down. Sewing, mending, accounts if you keep books. I don't want to be... She paused, choosing the word precisely. Cargo. You're not cargo. I'm currently lying on a kitchen table with 2 broken legs. That's temporary. I know it's temporary. I'm saying... She stopped, started again, and he could hear her feeling for the honest version of what she was trying to say. I came here to be a partner, not a project. I need you to treat me like one even when I'm flat on my back. He looked at the ceiling himself for a moment, considering. I'll tell you what needs doing, he said. You tell me what you can handle. We work from there. A pause. That's reasonable. I'm a reasonable man. I'm beginning to think you might be. He almost smiled at that and kept it off his face with some effort because the kitchen was getting light enough that she'd have been able to see it. The first week was the hardest, not because of Vivian, or not only because of Vivian. She was a difficult patient in specific ways. She fought the dependency instinct constantly, pushing to do things herself before she should, failing, accepting help with a grace that was clearly costing her something to summon. She was also, in the intervals between pain and frustration, exactly what her letters had suggested. Sharp and funny, in an understated way, observant, inclined to ask questions that people didn't expect, and then actually listen to the answers. But the town was a different problem. Harlan Creek had been willing enough to tolerate the idea of a mail-order bride when it was abstract. A woman arriving, settling in, becoming a wife and mother in the ordinary manner, that was legible to people. What was happening instead was something else. A woman who had nearly died, who was lying on Silas Boone's kitchen table with broken legs, whose recovery was uncertain, whose future on the ranch was unclear, and for whom Silas had ridden alone into the Badlands and apparently abandoned his good sense. People had opinions. He heard them secondhand through the stable hand and more directly from Franklin Ware, who stopped by on the fourth day under the pretext of returning a borrowed auger and stayed long enough to indicate, with the careful diplomacy of a man who thought he was being subtle, that not everyone in town believed this arrangement was going to work out. "People are saying you rushed into something," Franklin said, standing in the yard while Silas mended the east fence. "People are usually saying something," Silas replied. "She may not recover fully. The doctor—" "I know what the doctor said." "Silas." Franklin lowered his voice, though there was no one to hear. "You've got Maggie to think about. If this woman if she's not able to function as a—" "Franklin." He set down the mending tool and looked at the older man directly. "Maggie is fine, Vivian is recovering, the ranch is running, and what happens in my house is my business." He held the look for a moment. "I appreciate you coming by." Franklin left and Silas went back to the fence, and that was the end of that conversation, though not of the opinions behind it. What no one in town saw, because they weren't there, and because Silas wasn't in the habit of reporting on his household to people who hadn't asked to be helpful, was what was actually happening inside the house. Maggie came home from school every afternoon and went directly to the kitchen or to whichever room Vivian had been moved to that day. They'd gotten her to the bedroom by the end of the second day, which was a relief to everyone, including the kitchen table. The girl would sit beside her and they would talk, or Maggie would read, or sometimes they'd just be in the same room while Maggie did her schoolwork, and Vivian did whatever Silas had found for her hands, mending mostly, which she was extraordinarily good at, working with the small, precise stitches of someone trained in a tailoring house. He walked in one evening to find them in the middle of an argument about a mathematics problem. Not a fight. An argument, which is different, both of them with their heads bent over Maggie's slate and both of them clearly enjoying it. "That's not how the teacher did it," Maggie was saying, with the particular firmness of a child who has learned a method and is suspicious of alternatives. "Your teacher's method arrives at the correct answer but takes 3 times as long," Vivian said. "This way is faster." "But what if I get confused?" "Then you practice until you don't." A pause, softer. "Try it once. If you don't like it, you can go back to your teacher's way." Maggie tried it, arrived at the answer, stared at the slate. "That was faster," she said, in the tone of someone being fair about it against their initial preference. "Usually is." He backed out of the doorway before either of them noticed him. Vivian's fever came on the 9th day. He should have seen it coming. Beckett had warned him that infection was a real risk given the conditions of her injury, the time she'd spent in the field without treatment. But she had been recovering so steadily, color coming back, eating properly, her leg pain stabilizing, that he had let himself believe the worst was behind them. He noticed it in the evening. She was at the bedroom window, which she'd taken to sitting near in the afternoons because she could see the east pasture from there, and he came in with dinner, and she didn't turn when he entered, which was unlike her. "Vivian." She turned then, and her eyes were wrong. Not sharp the way they usually were, but slightly unfocused, the look of someone whose attention is being pulled inward. "I'm fine," she said. He crossed to her and put his hand on her forehead and felt the heat radiating before he'd fully made contact. "You have a fever." "I noticed," she said, with a ghost of her usual dryness. "I was hoping it was the room. I'm getting Beckett." "It's late. I'm getting Beckett." He said it without raising his voice, the same flat finality he used with the horses when they were being difficult. She looked at him, and he could see the part of her that wanted to argue and the part that understood she was in no position to, and she pressed her lips together and nodded. He was out of the room before she finished nodding. Beckett came and confirmed what Silas already knew from every ranching instinct he had, from years of watching animals go bad after injury. The fever was infection, and it had taken hold, and the next days were going to determine a great deal. Maggie was sent to Mrs. Callahan's again that night. Not because he was trying to shield her, but because he needed his full attention on one thing, and he couldn't do that and watch his daughter's face at the same time. He sat with Vivian through the fever's rise. She was not, as it turned out, a quiet patient when the fever was high. She talked, not sense, not mostly, the loose fragmented speech of someone whose mind was running hot and loose, but he stayed beside her and answered what could be answered and let the rest pass. And once, in the deepest part of the night, when the fever had peaked to something alarming, she grabbed his hand and held it with both of hers and said, Clearly, and with complete lucidity, "I'm not done yet." "I know," he said. "I didn't come all this way to pet." "I know, Vivian." She held his hand tighter. "Tell her. Tell Maggie I'm not. You can tell her yourself in the morning." A silence, then quieter. "Promise me." "I'm not promising you anything," he said. "You're going to be here to tell her yourself." She seemed to hear that on some level below the fever. Her grip eased, not releasing but settling into something less frantic, and she lay back against the pillow with her eyes still open, staring at the ceiling. "I decided," she said, faintly. "I already decided." "I know," he said. "I read the letter." He didn't let go of her hand. Outside, the night moved on toward morning the way nights do. Not quickly, not kindly, just steadily, 1 hour at a time. The dark thinning by degrees so slow you couldn't catch the change happening, only realize eventually that the window was gray where it had been black. Vivian's breathing evened out. The fever was still there, but the peak had passed. Her grip on his hand loosened into sleep. He stayed where he was. He thought about what Beckett had said on the porch. 4 days out there, she shouldn't be alive. And he thought about the drag marks on the canyon floor, 2 miles of them. The absolute bloody-minded refusal of a woman who had decided that her word meant something and was going to honor it regardless of what the desert thought about that. He looked at her face in the early light, still too pale, still showing the wear of everything she'd been through. And he thought that whatever the next days brought, whatever the fever decided, she had already done something that he was going to carry around for the rest of his life. She had kept moving, when there was no reason to, when the math said stop, when her body was failing under her and the canyon offered nothing but more rock and more heat and more silence. She had kept moving, 1 arm's length at a time, in the direction of a promise. He pressed his other hand over hers and stayed until full light came through the window and the ranch woke up around them, and then he stayed a little longer. The fever broke on the 3rd day. Not dramatically. There was no single moment of crisis and resolution, no clear line between danger and safety. It was more like a tide going out, slow and incremental, the heat in her skin receding by degrees through the long hours of the 2nd night and into the gray of the 3rd morning. Silas was asleep in the chair when it happened, his chin on his chest and his hand still resting near hers on the coverlet, and when he woke just after dawn, the room felt different in a way he registered before he was fully conscious, quieter, less pressurized, like the air after a storm moves through. He put his hand to her forehead. Cool. Not cold. She was still pale and worn down to something thin, but the fever heat was gone. He sat back and let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for 3 days. Vivian opened her eyes about 20 minutes later. She looked at the ceiling first, then at the window, then at him. And the gray of her eyes was clear and focused in the way it hadn't been since the fever took hold. "You look terrible," she said. "Good morning," he said. She tried to push herself up on her elbows and managed it, slowly, and looked around the room with the methodical attention of someone taking inventory. The medicine bottles on the side table, the chair he'd been sleeping in, the state of the light outside. "How long?" she asked. 3 days. She absorbed that. Something moved across her face. Not fear, she'd passed the point where fear was her first response to bad news, but a kind of reckoning. 3 days of her life that she hadn't been present for, that had happened to her without her participation. He could see her accounting for them, filing them, and moving on. "Maggie?" she said. "At Mrs. Callahan's. She's fine. She wanted to come back yesterday, and I told her to wait 1 more day." "Bring her home," Vivian said, and it wasn't a request exactly, but it wasn't an order either. It was the voice of someone who has been separated from something that matters and is now indicating clearly that the separation should end. "I'll send for her this morning." Vivian nodded and lay back against the pillow. She was quiet for a moment, and he let the quiet sit, and then she said, "I remember some of it, the fever. I remember—" She stopped. "I said things." "You did. Were they—" She paused, choosing her words with the care she always chose them. "Were they embarrassing?" He thought about, "I'm not done yet, and I already decided," in the way she'd held his hand in both of hers in the deep of the night. "No," he said, "they weren't." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that told him she suspected he was editing and that she was choosing to accept the edit. Then she turned toward the window and looked out at the east pasture in the early light. "I need to eat something," she said. He almost smiled. "I'll get breakfast." But Beckett came that afternoon and confirmed what Silas had already assessed. The infection had run its course, the fever was gone, the legs were holding in their splints. He did his examination with his usual economy of motion and expression, then sat back and folded his hands and looked at Vivian with a directness that she matched without difficulty. "You're not out of danger," he said. "You know that." "I know that. The next 6 weeks are going to determine a great deal about the left leg. You need to stay off it completely. I mean, completely, not mostly. Any weight bearing before the bone has time to knit is going to cost you." "You told me 6 weeks before," she said. I agreed to 6 weeks. "That was before the fever. The infection puts additional stress on the healing process. I want 8 weeks now." Vivian's expression didn't change, but something tightened around her eyes. "8 weeks," she said. 8 weeks minimum. And I want you eating properly. Not politely, properly. Meat, fat, whatever Silas can provide. Your body burned through everything it had out there, and it needs to rebuild." She nodded, a single motion. "All right." Beckett stood and picked up his bag. At the door he paused, which was becoming something of a habit for him when he left this house. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Mercer," he said. He said Miss Mercer deliberately, and she noticed it. The use of her unmarried name, the slight emphasis that said what the words around it didn't say. "You generally are," she said. "The left leg may not heal to full function. There's damage to the bone that corrected badly before I could get to it. You may walk with a permanent limp. You may have pain in cold weather for the rest of your life." He paused. "I'm not saying this to discourage you. I'm saying it because you seem like someone who makes better decisions with accurate information." "I am," she said. "Then that's your accurate information." He left. Silas stayed where he was, in the doorway, watching Vivian, who was looking at the window again with that same expression she'd had when he'd told her 40 miles, the expression of someone doing arithmetic. "Say it," she said, without turning. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were thinking something. I can hear you thinking from here." He came into the room and sat in the chair beside the bed. He thought about what to say for a moment, because with her, the words mattered. She was going to hear exactly what he said, not a softer version of it. "I'm thinking that you survived 4 days in the Badlands on 2 broken legs," he said, "and a fever that Beckett told me on the second night he wasn't sure you'd come through. And I'm thinking that a limp is something you'd handle the same way you handled everything else." She was quiet for a long time. "I'm not afraid of a limp," she said finally. "I'm afraid of—" She stopped herself. "What?" Another pause. He waited, because she wasn't a woman who filled silence with words when she needed to think, and he'd learned enough about her to give her the room. "I'm afraid of being a burden," she said at last, flatly, without self-pity, in the same tone she'd used to report a fence post that needed replacing. "I came here to be useful, to pull my share. If I can't—" She stopped again. "I've never in my adult life depended on someone else to manage my situation. Not since I was 17. I've managed my own situation, always, and I know how to do that. What I don't know how to do is—" She made a small gesture with one hand indicating the bed, the splints, the window, all of it. "Be taken care of," he said. "Be a problem someone has to solve," she corrected. He thought about that for a moment. "Vivian, I rode into the Badlands because I wanted to, not because you were a problem I had to solve." He paused. "You're a person I wanted to find." She looked at him. The gray eyes were direct and a little raw at the edges, the way eyes look when someone has been fighting for a long time and is very tired and is trying very hard not to show it. "That's a kind thing to say?" she said carefully. "It's a true thing to say." She didn't answer that. He didn't push it. He picked up the book from the side table, Maggie's book, which had migrated permanently to this room, and held it up. "Do you want me to read?" he asked. She looked at the book, then at him, and something in her face shifted in the small, private way it did sometimes when something surprised her. "Yes," she said. "All right." He opened it and read, until she fell asleep. Maggie came back that evening. She came in the front door and went directly to the bedroom without stopping to take off her coat, which was unlike her. She was usually particular about order, and stopped in the doorway and looked at Vivian for a long, assessing moment. Vivian looked back. "You're better," Maggie said. Not a question. "Better than I was," Vivian said. "Not as good as I'm going to be." Maggie considered this statement with the gravity she gave everything. Then she came into the room, hung her coat on the peg on the back of the door, so she hadn't forgotten the order, she'd just reordered the priorities, and sat down in the chair Silas had vacated. "Mrs. Callahan's cat had kittens," she said, "while I was there." "How many?" "5. One of them kept climbing on my head in the night." A pause. "I didn't really mind." "Cats have no sense of appropriate timing," Vivian said. "She said I could have one if you—" Maggie stopped, recalibrated. "If Papa says yes." Vivian looked at her steadily. "That's a question for your father." "I know." Another pause, careful. "But would you mind if there was a cat?" There was something in the way she asked it, the precision of it, asking Vivian's preference as a person in the house rather than as an adult authority who needed to be managed. That said something about how the girl's mind worked, how she had been paying attention to the shape of this arrangement without being told to. "I wouldn't mind a cat," Vivian said. Maggie nodded, apparently satisfied, and took out her school book. Checked. The town's opinion, which had been building in Silas's periphery since the day he'd ridden south, arrived in organized form about 2 weeks after the fever broke, in the person of 3 women from the ladies' auxiliary who came to the door on a Wednesday afternoon under the premise of bringing food. They did bring food. They also brought an hour of conversation that Silas managed to mostly deflect, but which contained enough pointed questions about Vivian's condition and recovery prospects and ability to manage a household that he was still irritated about it when he brought the dishes back to the bedroom. Vivian had heard everything. The walls of the house were not thick. She looked at him when he came in and he set the dishes down and said, "They mean well. I'm sure some of them do," she said, with a neutrality that was considerably more restrained than what he suspected she actually thought. "Mrs. Farrow asked how your legs were healing. I heard her ask how your daughter was managing without proper female guidance in the home." He sat down. He rubbed his face with one hand. "Vivian, I'm not offended," she said. "I'm not surprised either. I came here knowing I'd have to earn my place. I just didn't expect to have to do it from a bed." She looked at the ceiling. "What exactly are they saying? The straightforward version." He thought about whether to soften it and decided, as he always did with her, that she'd see through the softening and it would just add a step. "That I made a poor decision. That you may not recover enough to be useful. That Maggie needs stability and not—" He paused. "An uncertain situation." She was quiet for a moment. "They're not entirely wrong," she said. "Vivian, about the uncertainty," she said. "They're not wrong that the situation is uncertain. They're wrong about what to do about it." She turned her head and looked at him. "What do you actually think? And I want the version you'd tell yourself, not the version you'd tell me to keep things calm." He looked at her for a moment. The directness of her, it was never aggressive, never combative, just completely consistent. She meant what she said, and she expected you to do the same, and she didn't see the point in operating any other way. "I think you're going to recover," he said. "I think it's going to take longer than you want and be harder than it should be, and you're going to be angry about it at least twice a week. I think Maggie is doing better than she was 3 months ago, and some of that is you. And I think the people in town who are worried can keep worrying because it's not their household." She held his gaze. "You said that very well," she said. "I meant it very well." Something moved in her face. That small, private shift again, there and gone. "I'm going to need crutches," she said, changing direction the way she did when a conversation had arrived somewhere and she didn't know what to do with where it had landed. "Beckett said another 4 weeks before I can try to bear weight, but if I had crutches, I could at least start moving. Get out of this room. See the rest of the house." "I'll talk to the carpenter. And I want to learn the accounts," she said. "You keep books. I saw the ledger on your desk. Let me do the accounts while I'm in bed. It gives me something real to do, and it's one less thing on your list." He thought about arguing and knew it was pointless. "All right. And I want to write to the surviving passengers from the coach," she said. "If there are any. I don't know what happened to the others. I should know. That one stopped him. He hadn't thought about it, hadn't let himself think about the others, too focused on the immediate, on Vivian, on the ranch. He felt a small shame about that. I'll find out, he said, from the Army report. She nodded. Thank you. He stood to leave and she said, Silas. He turned. I meant what I said in the canyon, she said, about not quitting because of a horse ride. She held his eyes with a steadiness that cost her something. He could see the cost, but she didn't look away. I'm not quitting. I want you to know that. Whatever happens with the leg, whatever the town says, whatever Beckett's careful, honest answers add up to, I am not quitting. He stood in the doorway looking at her for a moment. I know, he said. I never thought you were. The Army report came back through the garrison at Millsford 2 weeks later. Of the 6 passengers on the coach, 2 had died in the crash itself. One, a traveling merchant, had survived with a broken arm and been found by the Army search party on the first day, conscious and ambulatory, and had been transported to Millsford for treatment. 2 more, a husband and wife traveling to visit family, had been found by the same search party, alive, the husband with a head wound and the wife uninjured. They had sheltered in the partial shade of the overturned coach until the Army arrived. The driver had not survived. Vivian read the report twice, sitting up in bed with the paper in both hands. Then she folded it and held it in her lap for a while without speaking. The driver, she said finally. Yes. He was... She paused. He had a photograph. He showed it to the passengers before we left Cheyenne. His family. 3 children. She was quiet for another moment. I didn't know his name. Beckett might know. Someone in Millsford would. Find out, she said. I want to write to his family. He didn't ask why or argue the point. I'll find out. She handed the report back to him and picked up the ledger he'd brought her that morning, and he understood she was done with the grief portion of this, not because she'd finished with it, but because she had a method. Look at the thing directly, account for it, put it in its place, keep moving. He recognized it because he'd developed something similar after his wife died, the particular discipline of a person who cannot afford to stop. He left her to the accounts and went back to the fence. The crutches arrived on a Thursday, built by the carpenter in town to the measurements Beckett had specified, padded at the tops with leather that Mrs. Callahan had contributed without being asked. They were ugly and functional and exactly right. He brought them into the bedroom and set them against the wall beside the bed, and Vivian looked at them for a long time without speaking. 8 weeks, she said. That was today. Exactly 8 weeks from the fever. Beckett said to start slow, Silas said. A few steps. See how it feels. I know what Beckett said, but she said it without heat. She was looking at the crutches with an expression he'd never seen on her before. Something unguarded, complicated. The face of someone who has been holding very still for a very long time and is now confronting the moment when the stillness ends. Maggie was in the doorway. She'd come home early from school on some instinct or prior agreement Silas hadn't been part of, and she was standing very still, watching. He helped Vivian sit up and swing her legs to the edge of the bed. She could do this herself now, had been doing it for weeks. And then he handed her the crutches one at a time, and she positioned them under her arms with the methodical care she gave everything, adjusting the angle, testing the grip. Then she stood. It wasn't elegant. Her left leg took no weight, and the right was stiff from weeks of immobility, and she swayed forward, and he put his hand out, and she shook her head. One sharp motion, don't, and found her balance on her own, breathing through her nose, jaw tight. She stood. She was tall. He'd known that from carrying her, but seeing her vertical and upright in the afternoon light of the bedroom, was different from knowing it. She took one step with the crutches, then another. Then she stopped and stood still, and she was shaking. Not dramatically, just a fine tremor in her arms and shoulders, the effort of it. Okay, she said, mostly to herself. Then louder. Okay! He heard Maggie make a sound behind him, very small, quickly suppressed. Vivian heard it too. She turned, carefully, redistributing weight on the crutches, and looked at Maggie in the doorway, and something passed between them that he didn't have a name for and didn't try to name. Maggie stepped into the room and came to stand beside her, and Vivian took one hand off the left crutch and put it briefly on the girl's shoulder. One moment, just that, and then put it back. "Shall we try the hall?" Vivian said. "Yes," Maggie said immediately. They went into the hall. 3 steps, 5, to the end and back. Vivian's face was gray with effort by the time she sat back on the edge of the bed, but her eyes were bright in a way they hadn't been since before the fever. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'm going further." "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll see how this feels first." She looked at him with an expression that said she was agreeing to that only provisionally, and he accepted the provisional. She made it to the kitchen by the end of the first week of crutches. This was significant in ways both practical and otherwise. Practically, it meant she could sit at the table for meals instead of eating from a tray, could see out the kitchen window to the yard and the barn, could be part of the household in a spatial way rather than only an auditory one. Otherwise, it meant she was visible, to him, to Maggie, and to the steady trickle of people who came by the ranch on the ordinary business of being neighbors, and who now encountered Vivian Mercer at the kitchen table instead of hearing reports of her from Silas. The first person to sit across from her at that table who hadn't specifically come to assess her situation was a man named Del Greer, who ran the neighboring spread to the east and came by to return a borrowed piece of equipment and ended up in the kitchen because that's where people always ended up at a ranch. He was in his 50s, leathery and direct, the kind of man who'd been working land so long that most of his conversation was practical and most of his social niceties had been worn down to their useful parts. He sat down with a cup of coffee and looked at Vivian and said, "You're the one that came in from the Badlands." "I am," she said. "Heard you dragged yourself 2 miles. "About that." He drank his coffee. "That's a hell of a thing," he said, without ceremony or exaggeration, just assessment, and went on to talk to Silas about fence lines. Vivian, he noticed afterward, seemed more comfortable after that exchange than she had after any of the more carefully managed social visits. There was something about being seen plainly, without management or performance on either side, that suited her. He filed that away. The question of the wedding, which had been occupying a peripheral space in his thoughts since before the accident and had been set aside entirely during the crisis, came back to the surface on a quiet evening in the 5th week after the fever. He hadn't raised it. He wasn't entirely sure how to raise it, which was unusual for him. He was not generally a man who found direct conversation difficult. But this particular conversation had several layers of complication that he couldn't fully untangle. Vivian had come here under an agreement. That agreement still stood, as far as he was concerned. But she had also arrived injured and dependent, and had spent weeks in a condition that made any conversation about the future feel like pressure he didn't want to put on her. She raised it herself, in the way she raised most things, without preamble, while they were doing something else entirely. She was at the table working on a shirt she'd been mending for him. She'd found it in the mending pile and absorbed it into her regular work without comment. And he was at the other end going through the accounts she'd organized, and Maggie was in the parlor doing schoolwork. And it was the kind of quiet evening that had become, without anyone designing it, the shape of a household. "I've been thinking," she said without looking up from the shirt, "about the arrangement." He set down the ledger. "The arrangement. You came here with expectations," she said. "We both did. The situation has changed considerably from what either of us planned." She paused, still not looking up, working a stitch. "I think it's reasonable to revisit what we agreed to." "What specifically are you revisiting?" he said carefully. She set the shirt down and looked at him directly. "I want to know if you still want to marry me," she said. "And I want you to answer honestly, not kindly." He was quiet for a moment. "Those aren't always different things," he said. "They are sometimes." He thought about how to answer, about the ledger she'd organized so completely in the first 3 weeks that he'd had to spend an hour finding anything, about the way she'd read to Maggie when his own voice gave out from a cold 2 weeks ago and he hadn't asked her to. She'd just picked up the book and started. About the morning he'd come into the kitchen and found that she'd somehow, on crutches, made breakfast for all 3 of them before he was up. And when he'd asked how she'd managed it, she'd said carefully in that dry way of hers that still made him want to laugh. About the canyon, about the drag marks, about "I'm not done yet." "I want to marry you," he said. "That hasn't changed. It wasn't conditional on you arriving in perfect condition." She held his gaze, checking the answer for honesty the way she checked everything. "All right," she said. "All right? All right. I accept your answer." She picked up the shirt again, then after a moment, "I want to be married before I try to walk without the crutches." That surprised him. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment, working the stitch. "Because I want the trying to be as a member of this family," she said, "not as a guest who hasn't decided yet." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll talk to the judge," he said. "He can come to the ranch." She nodded, eyes on the shirt. But he saw it. The small, private shift in her expression, the thing she didn't name. He went back to the accounts. The wedding happened on a Saturday, 3 weeks later. Judge Waller came out from town, a short, practical man who had married people in kitchens and barns, and once on a flatboat and had no particular opinions about setting. Vivian sat at the kitchen table because standing for the full ceremony was still beyond her, and Silas stood beside her, and Maggie stood on Vivian's other side in her good dress and her white gloves, which she had cleaned again for the occasion. It was brief. The words were the same words that had been used for every wedding in every kitchen and barn and flatboat, worn smooth by repetition, which made them feel less like an event and more like a continuation of something that was already underway. When it was done, Judge Waller shook Silas's hand and nodded to Vivian and accepted a cup of coffee and told Maggie that her gloves were very fine and left. Maggie turned to Vivian afterward and said, with the gravity of someone who had been holding a question for a long time, "Should I still call you Vivian?" Vivian looked at her. Outside, the late afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window at that particular angle that turned everything it touched a pale, warm gold. "What would you like to call me?" she said. Maggie considered this at length, then, "Can I decide later?" "You can decide whenever you're ready," Vivian said. "There's no hurry." Maggie nodded. Then she went back to the parlor, and they heard her moving around in there, rearranging something, the small sounds of a child resettling in a space that had just quietly changed. Silas poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Vivian and sat down. She was looking at the window. Outside, the east pasture was going golden in the light, the grass he'd been nursing for 3 years moving in the wind. "It's a good piece of land," she said. "It is. Spring's going to be busy. If the herd expands like you're planning, you'll need help with the east fence before the new cattle come in." "I know." She picked up her coffee. "I'll be off the crutches by then." He looked at her profile in the late light, the set of her jaw, the particular quality of her attention when she was planning something, the absolute unromantic practicality of a woman who had just gotten married and was thinking about the spring fence line. "Probably," he said. She turned and looked at him, and for once she didn't have the answer ready, and for once she didn't seem to need one. The afternoon settled around them, the kitchen warm and quiet, and somewhere in the next room Maggie was moving furniture and muttering to herself about placement. They drank their coffee. Outside, the light kept doing what it did in the late afternoon on this piece of land, filling the window, touching everything, making the ordinary look for a few minutes like exactly what it was. She left the crutches on a Tuesday morning in late October. Not ceremoniously. She didn't announce it or wait for an audience. Silas came into the kitchen at 6:30 and found her standing at the stove making coffee, both crutches leaning against the wall 3 feet away, her weight distributed between her 2 legs with the careful deliberateness of someone who has run a calculation and decided the numbers are good enough. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't look at him, but she knew he was there. "Don't say anything," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say be careful." "I wasn't," he said, which was a partial truth at best. She poured the coffee and turned and took 4 steps to the table without the crutches, and the left leg was visibly uneven. A hitch in the gait, a slight drop on that side, the permanent souvenir of 6 weeks spent setting wrong in a canyon. But she moved, and she sat down, and she set the cups on the table with steady hands. Then she looked at him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, and sat down. He thought about the day she'd first stood up in this room with the crutches, the fine tremor in her arms, the gray of her face with the effort. He thought about the 8 weeks before that, the fever, the canyon, the drag marks in the dust. He picked up his coffee cup and said nothing further because there wasn't anything further to say that the moment hadn't already said. She drank her coffee and looked out the window at the east pasture. The grass had gone winter brown and the light was thin and low, the way October light got in this part of Wyoming, coming in at an angle that lit everything sideways instead of from above. The fence on the south section needs work before the first hard frost, she said. I know. I was going to get to it this week. Del Greer said he could spare his man on Friday if you need extra hands. He looked at her. When did you talk to Del Greer? He came by yesterday while you were in the north pasture. I gave him coffee. A pause. He's not as rough as he seems. He's just not interested in performing otherwise. Silas looked at his wife and thought, not for the first time, that she had developed a more accurate picture of most of the people in this county in 4 months of largely enforced stillness than he'd managed in 12 years of living here. I'll take him up on Friday, he said. She nodded and went back to looking at the east pasture, and the mornings settled around them in the way mornings did now in this house, occupied, purposeful, the quiet of people who have enough to do and enough reason to do it. Maggie started calling her mama sometime around the middle of November. It wasn't announced. There was no conversation leading up to it, no request for permission, no moment where Vivian sat her down and said the door was open. It just happened the way things happened with Maggie. Internally first, at length and in private, and then fully formed when it emerged. She said it at breakfast one morning. Mama, can you pass the salt? And Vivian's hand went still on the coffee pot for just a moment, so briefly that Silas wasn't sure he'd seen it, and then she passed the salt and said of course, and the conversation moved on, and that was that. He found Vivian in the barn an hour later. She was doing the things she'd taken up in the past few weeks since getting mobile, spending time in the barn, learning the horses by name and personality the way she learned everything, methodically and without rushing. She was standing with her hand on the neck of the gray mare, the one who was skittish with strangers, and the mare was not being skittish. He came and stood beside her. She called you Mama, he said. I heard. Her voice was level, but something in it wasn't quite level. Are you all right? She was quiet for a moment. Her hand moved on the mare's neck in a slow, absent rhythm. I had a mother until I was 14, she said. After that, I had a series of situations that I managed alone. She paused. I've been telling myself for months not to want that word from her, that it wasn't fair to want it, that she should come to it in her own time or not at all. She stopped again. I apparently did not succeed in not wanting it. He didn't say anything. Sometimes with her the most useful thing was silence. She decided on her own, Vivian said after a moment. That matters to me. That she decided. She doesn't decide things lightly, he said. You know that about her. I know. She took her hand off the mare and turned, and her face was composed in the way it always was in public, but her eyes were a little too bright. She's remarkable, Silas. I know she's your daughter, and you can't be objective about it, but she is. The way she thinks, the way she absorbs things, and then waits until she understands them before she says anything about them. She shook her head slightly. I didn't expect to... She stopped. I know, he said quietly. She pressed her lips together and nodded and went back to the horse, and he left her there because she needed a minute, and she'd never ask for one. December brought the first hard frost, and with it the particular compressed activity of a working ranch preparing for winter. The final fence repairs, the stacking of feed, the assessment of the herd, the 100 small tasks that multiplied in the cold. Vivian was in the middle of all of it. She had graduated from crutches to a walking stick in the 3rd week of November, and the walking stick had been quietly set aside by the 1st week of December. The left leg still hitched. It was always going to hitch, they understood that now. But she'd adapted to it with the same unsentimental efficiency she brought to every new constraint, redistributing her weight, adjusting her stride, building the muscles that had atrophied during her months of stillness. She moved differently than she had before the accident and would for the rest of her life. But she moved. She'd taken over the household accounts entirely, reorganizing them into a system that made considerably more sense than the one he'd been using, and had identified 3 places where they'd been overpaying suppliers and 1 place where they'd been underpaid by a regular buyer of their cattle. She had started breeding records for the mares, something he'd been meaning to do for years and had never gotten to. She mended clothes, managed correspondence, ordered supplies from the catalog with the precision of someone who had spent years accounting for every dollar. And she learned the land. He'd been surprised by that. Not that she was interested, but by the depth of it. She wasn't content to know the ranch in the abstract. She wanted to walk the perimeter fences, visit the creek at the southeast corner, see the east meadow in different lights and seasons. She asked questions that revealed she'd been absorbing everything he'd said about the place since the beginning, building a picture that was detailed and particular. One afternoon in early December, he found her standing at the edge of the east meadow in the thin winter light, looking at the grass. "The native grass mix," she said when he came up beside her. "You said you spent 3 years on this." "About that." "What was here before?" "Mostly scrub. The previous owner overgrazed it." He stood beside her, looking out. "First 2 years I wasn't sure it was going to take. Third year it started to come in properly." She looked at the winter-brown meadow for a long time. "It's going to be extraordinary in spring," she said. "Usually is." She turned and looked at him with the particular expression she had when she was about to say something she'd been working up to. He'd learned to recognize it. "I want to learn to ride properly," she said. "I know how to sit a horse, basics, but I want to be able to work from horseback, actually useful, not just transported." He thought about the left leg. "It'll be hard on the hip, depending on how you—" "I'll manage the hip," she said, not dismissively, but with the absolute assurance of someone who has managed considerably worse. "Will you teach me?" He looked at her in the thin December light. This woman who had dragged herself 2 miles across stone to keep a promise, who had learned the names of his horses and the history of his grass and the gap in his accounts, who had stood at his stove on a Tuesday morning and left her crutches against the wall. "Yes," he said, "I'll teach you." Edmund Harrow arrived in Harlan Creek on the 14th of December. Silas didn't know he'd arrived for 2 days and didn't know who he was for one more after that, so Harrow had nearly 4 days in which to make his presence felt in town before Silas got the full picture of him. He heard the name first from Del Greer, who mentioned it in passing while they were checking the south fence. A man named Harrow, well-dressed, staying at the hotel, asking around about the Boone Ranch. Del said it without particular inflection, the way you reported a weather observation. He heard more from Mrs. Callahan, who appeared at the door 2 evenings later with the particular expression she wore when she had information she considered urgent. She told him that the man had introduced himself around town as someone who knew Vivian from St. Louis, a businessman of some standing, and that he had made several comments about the circumstances of her marriage that had not sat well with at least 2 people who'd reported them to Mrs. Callahan. "What comments?" Silas asked. Mrs. Callahan relayed them with the precision of someone who had memorized them for this purpose. Harrow had described the marriage as having been undertaken under duress. He had suggested that Vivian had been in a vulnerable position, injured, dependent, far from anyone who could advise her, and that the arrangement she'd entered into was not one she'd have chosen under normal circumstances. He had said, to at least 3 different people, that he intended to speak with her. Silas absorbed all of this in the way he absorbed most serious information, without visible reaction, and thanked Mrs. Callahan and brought her coffee before she left. Then he went and found Vivian. She was at the kitchen table with the breeding records, making notations in the careful handwriting that he'd have known anywhere by now. She looked up when he came in and read his face with the speed she always read things. "What happened?" she said. He sat down and told her straightforwardly, without softening and without editorializing. He told her the name and what he'd heard and what had been said around town. He watched her face as he talked. She heard the name and something changed in her expression. Not fear, but the recognition that preceded it, the specific alertness of someone who has heard a sound they didn't expect to hear in a place they thought was safe. She let him finish before she said anything. Then she sat very still for a moment. "Edmund Harrow," she said in a flat tone. "You know him." "Yes." A pause. "He employed me. In St. Louis. The tailoring house." She set down her pen. "He owned the business. I worked there for 3 years." He waited. He knew from months of learning her that she was choosing what to say next, not because she intended to deceive him, but because she was arranging the true version with care. "He believed," she said at last slowly, "that I owed him something, beyond wages, beyond what was agreed." She held his eyes steadily, making sure the meaning was clear without requiring her to be graphic about it. "I didn't agree with his assessment. I left his employment 18 months before I wrote to you." "Did he—" He stopped, because the question that came next wasn't one he was going to ask in a way that put anything on her. She answered it anyway. "He tried?" she said. "He didn't succeed, but he has a very long memory, and he doesn't accept that his version of events is not the only version." She paused. "He told me when I left that I would regret it, that I was no one, from nowhere, with nothing, and that I would find out what that meant without his support." She looked at the table. "I found out what it meant. It meant working twice as hard for half the money for 18 months before I had enough to travel." She looked back up. "He's not a man who has ever been told no by someone he considered beneath him." Silas thought about that for a moment. "What does he want?" he said. "Specifically." "He wants to prove that he can," she said, with a simplicity that was more chilling than anger would have been. "That I don't get to leave and make something of my own. That I'm still subject to his version of my life." She paused. "He'll come here. That's what the talk in town is. He's building to coming here. He wants an audience." "He won't get much satisfaction from me," Silas said. "He's not coming for you," she said. "He's coming for me. He wants to see if I'll fold, if months of injury and dependence have used up my backbone." She said it without self-pity, diagnosing the situation. "Men like Harrow keep a careful account of what circumstances do to people. He's been watching from a distance and he thinks my account is empty." She picked up her pen again, not to use it, just to have something in her hand. "What do you want to do?" he said. He asked it directly because that was how they operated, and because what happened next was hers to decide, not his. She looked at him. "I want to handle it myself," she said. "Publicly, in front of whoever's there." She paused. "He needs to hear it from me, and he needs to hear it where it can't be reframed afterward." "I'll be there," he said. "I know." She set the pen down. "But I'll do the talking." Harrow sent a note to the ranch the following morning. Written on hotel stationery in the large, unhurried hand of someone accustomed to being replied to promptly, it requested a meeting at Vivian's earliest convenience, expressed his concern for her well-being and his desire to speak with her privately before returning to St. Louis, and referred to himself throughout as a dear friend. It was a masterpiece of implication, generous, concerned, almost paternal, every sentence constructing a version of events in which he was the reasonable party, and everything else was a misunderstanding to be gently corrected. Vivian read it once, set it on the table, and wrote her reply. He watched her write it. She didn't draft it, didn't cross anything out. She wrote it straight through in about 4 minutes, signed it, folded it. "What did you say?" he asked. "I told him I'd meet him at the hotel on Thursday at 2 o'clock, in the dining room." She looked up. "Not privately." "He won't like the dining room." "No," she said. "He won't, I'll tell you." Thursday came in cold and clear, the kind of December day that was beautiful if you weren't working outside in it. Vivian put on her best dress, the dark green wool she'd had made in St. Louis, one of the few good things she'd brought with her, and her good coat, and she did her hair in the way she did when she intended to be taken seriously, which was pinned up and severe and entirely herself. She checked her left leg in the mirror, the slight hitch when she walked, and made no comment about it. Maggie was at school. She'd told Maggie only that they were going to town for a meeting, which was true, and Maggie had looked at her with those watchful eyes and said, all right in the tone she used when she understood more than she was being told and was choosing not to press it. Silas drove the wagon into town. Vivian sat beside him on the seat, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the road. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation, "but it's useful nervous, the kind that keeps you sharp." "Is there a kind that isn't useful?" "The kind that keeps you small," she said. "This isn't that kind." He'd remembered those words afterward for a long time. Harrow was already in the dining room when they arrived. He was exactly what his letter had suggested, a large, well-dressed man in his 50s with the particular ease of someone who has never had to wonder whether he belonged somewhere. He had silver at his temples and a quality of surface pleasantness that Silas recognized immediately as the social competence of someone who had learned that appearing reasonable was more effective than appearing powerful. He stood when Vivian came in, which was correct manners, and extended his hand, which she did not take. 2 other people were in the dining room, a couple eating at the far table who had gone quiet, and the hotel's man who had found something to arrange near the entrance. Harrow had chosen a table near the window, prominent. He'd wanted an audience too, Silas realized. He just wanted a different one who would see a concerned friend and a wayward woman being guided back to reason.
Vivian. Harrow's voice was warm. Practiced warmth, the kind that came from knowing when to use it. You look well, better than I feared, given what I'd heard. Edmund, she said, and sat down, not because he'd indicated the chair, but because she'd decided to. Silas sat beside her. Harrow looked at Silas with the assessment of a man who had already formed an opinion and was confirming it. Mr. Boone, he said, I appreciate you bringing her in. I'd hoped to speak with Vivian privately, but I understand that may not have been— We came together, Vivian said, because we go places together. That's how it works. She folded her hands on the table. Say what you came to say, Edmund. He shifted his expression to something more candid, more serious, the face of reluctant honesty. I'm concerned about you, he said. I've been concerned since I heard about the accident, the circumstances of this arrangement. You were injured, alone, without anyone to advise you, and you entered into a legal agreement that— I entered into a marriage, Vivian said, that I had agreed to before the accident in sound mind in correspondence conducted over 4 months. There was no circumstance of duress. There was no absence of advisors. I don't require advisors to make decisions about my own life. She held his gaze. That is the accurate version. Vivian. His tone shifted. Not aggressive, something more intimate, more personal, the voice for private conversations. You were vulnerable. You were injured and dependent on a man you'd only just met. I understand why you felt— Edmund. She said his name cleanly, without heat. I'm going to stop you at that word. Vulnerable. You've been using it since you arrived in this town with several people who don't know me because it does the work you need it to do. It suggests I wasn't competent, that I needed protection I didn't get, that this— She indicated the room, herself, Silas, all of it, is something that happened to me rather than something I chose. She paused. I was injured. I was not incompetent. Those are different things. I'd like you to understand the difference. Harrow was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not the surface pleasantness now, but something underneath it, and it was not pleasant. You left St. Louis with nothing, he said, and the warmth had dropped a degree. Everything you had, every contact, every reference, every opportunity. Every opportunity you controlled, she said. Yes, I left that. She said it evenly. And then I built something else, which is what people do when they leave things they should have left sooner. The couple at the far table had stopped pretending to eat. I came here as a courtesy, Harrow said, and his voice had shifted again, the pleasantness gone entirely now, the thing beneath it fully visible. To offer you a way back before you've committed yourself to something you'll spend years regretting. I have standing in St. Louis. I have resources. I'm offering you— You're not offering me anything, Vivian said. The quiet of her voice was, Silas thought, more effective than volume would have been. You're trying to collect something you believe you're owed. You've always believed you were owed something from me, and you were wrong then, and you're wrong now, and you traveled a considerable distance to be wrong in front of more people than usual. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at him directly. I work a ranch in Wyoming, she said. I keep the books. I manage the correspondence. I know the name of every horse on the property. I have a daughter who called me Mama. I have a husband who rode into the Badlands alone to find me because I made a promise and he believed I would keep it. She paused. You told me when I left that I was no one from nowhere with nothing. I want you to look at me and tell me if that's still what you see. The room was very quiet. Harrow looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas. Then he looked back at Vivian, and whatever he'd been carrying when he walked through the door, whatever he'd expected this to be, it had been replaced by something he hadn't prepared for and didn't know how to use. I see you've made your decision, he said finally, and his voice was flat now, stripped of performance. I made it months ago, she said. You just needed to hear it in person. He stood. He straightened his coat with the deliberate movements of a man gathering himself. He looked at her one more time with an expression that she held without blinking, without moving, without giving him the uncertainty he'd come here to find. Good day, Vivian, he said. Good day, Edmund.
He walked out of the dining room. The door of the hotel closed behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. The couple at the far table resumed eating with the studied normalness of people pretending they hadn't heard everything. Vivian sat still for a moment. Then she picked up the menu that was on the table and looked at it. "I'd like coffee," she said, and her voice was entirely steady, though he could see that her hands, hidden below the table, were not. "And something to eat. I didn't have much breakfast." He raised his hand for the hotel's man. "Coffee for two," he said, "and whatever's warm." Vivian set the menu down and looked out the window at the main street of Harlan Creek, the dry goods store, the post office, the livery, the ordinary working infrastructure of a small town going about its December business. "He'll go back to St. Louis," she said. "Yes. He won't come back."
"No," Silas said. He was certain of that, though he couldn't have said exactly why, except that Harrow was the kind of man who depended on uncertainty in other people, and she had left him none to work with. The coffee arrived. She wrapped both hands around her cup, and there, close up, he could see the slight tremor she'd been keeping out of her voice, and she held it and let the warmth work. "I've been thinking about that since the letter arrived," she said. "What I was going to say." A pause. "I was afraid I wouldn't be able to say it right." "You said it right." She looked at him sideways. "I was shaking the whole time." "I know. I didn't want you to know." "I know that too." He picked up his own cup. "Vivian, being afraid and doing it anyway is still doing it." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that went through several things in quick succession and settled on something that he thought was the closest she'd come in all their months together to being fully undone. "Don't be kind to me in public," she said, a little roughly. "I'm barely holding this together." He looked away, out the window, giving her the room. "I'm just drinking my coffee," he said. She exhaled slowly. "Yes," she said. "All right. Yes." They drank their coffee, and outside the December afternoon moved on around them, and the town went about its business. And somewhere on the road west, a man who had traveled a long way to find something that was no longer there turned back toward where he'd come from. She was quiet on the drive home. Not the closed quiet she'd had at the beginning, the defended kind that kept everything inside and let nothing through. This was the quiet of someone who had said what needed saying and was now in the aftermath of it, the strange hollow space that opens up when you've been braced against something for so long that its absence feels like a change in pressure. He didn't try to fill it. They turned off the main road onto the ranch track, and the familiar landscape came up around them. The east fence line, the creek trees, the barn roof showing above the low rise, and he felt her settle beside him, a physical thing, the slight shift of her shoulders as she let out a breath. "I wrote to him once," she said, "after I left St. Louis, asking for a character reference for a new position. He didn't reply." She paused. "I've thought about that letter 1,000 times, sitting down and writing it, what I must have been hoping." She shook her head slightly. "There were several years in my life when I kept trying to find a way to make things work within the situation rather than just leaving the situation. It took me too long to understand that some situations don't improve. They just consume you more slowly." He thought about that. "What made you finally leave?" She was quiet for a moment. "I got tired," she said simply. "Not weak tired, the kind of tired that becomes clarity." She looked at the road ahead. "I realized that the worst case for leaving was the same as the best case for staying. And once you see that, there's only one thing to do." The house came into view at the end of the track, smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, the barn sitting solid in the low winter light. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me handle it. It was yours to handle. Some men would have—" She stopped. "Some men would have wanted to be the one to do it." "Some men are idiots," he said. She looked at him sharply, and then, unexpectedly, genuinely, she laughed. Not the small, controlled sound she sometimes made that was more acknowledgement than laughter. An actual laugh, briefly full, before she caught it back. "You are," she said, "occasionally very funny." He pulled up in front of the barn. Porter came out from somewhere and stood wagging in the yard, tail going. Vivian watched the dog for a moment. "Maggie will be home in an hour," she said. "She will. I want to tell her about today. The general shape of it, not the details."
She paused. She should know that someone from my past came and tried to tell her what I was, and that I told him what I am instead.
He thought about that, about a girl who had learned not to ask for the things she needed most, about the lesson in that, if it was given right. I think she should hear that from you, he said.
Vivian nodded and climbed down from the wagon, the left leg taking the step with that characteristic drop and recovery, and she walked toward the house with the gait that was entirely her own now, uneven and unhurried, and going exactly where she intended, and Porter fell in beside her without being asked, as if this had always been the arrangement. He sat in the wagon for a moment after she went inside. The light was going early, the way it did in December, pulling back from the pastures and leaving the sky a pale, washed-out gold at the western edge. The east meadow was visible from here, winter-brown and still, the native grass he'd spent 3 years nursing along lying flat and waiting for spring. He thought about what she'd said. The worst case for leaving was the same as the best case for staying, and about how long it must have taken someone as deliberate as she was to arrive at that, and what it had cost her in the time before she got there. He thought about a woman who had written him a letter that began with, "I am not writing because I believe in fairy stories," and meant it then, and probably still meant it, and who had nonetheless crossed half a continent and crawled across a canyon floor and turned down the only escape she'd been offered and stood in front of the man who'd defined her limits and told him, in plain language, that she was something else now. Porter came back out from the house and sat in the yard, looking at him, waiting. "Yeah," Silas said to the dog, and climbed down from the wagon. "Yeah, all right." He went inside. Maggie listened to the whole story without interrupting. That was unusual for her. She was a child who asked questions, specific and targeted, and she rarely let a narrative run past a point of confusion without stopping it. But she sat at the kitchen table that evening with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on Vivian's face, and she didn't say a word until Vivian was finished. Then she said, "He thought you'd be scared." "Yes," Vivian said. "He did." "Were you?" "Yes." Maggie thought about that for a moment, working it through. "But you did it anyway," she said. "Yes." "So being scared didn't matter?" Vivian looked at the girl across the table, this child who had been taking careful notes on the world since before she could properly read it, filing everything away, building her understanding of how things actually worked rather than how she'd been told they worked. "It mattered," Vivian said. "Being scared is real. I don't want you to think it wasn't. I was shaking the whole time." She paused. "But scared and stopped are two different things. You can be one without being the other." Maggie turned that over. "Okay," she said finally, in the tone she used when she'd added something to a permanent file. Then, "Is he going to come back?" "No," Vivian said. "He's not." "How do you know?" "Because he came for something that isn't there anymore," she said. "Men like that need a door to push against. Once you take the door away, there's nothing for them to do." Maggie nodded slowly. Then she picked up her fork and went back to her dinner, and the kitchen resettled around them. The stove ticking, Porter shifting under the table, the ordinary sounds of an evening going about its business. Silas looked at his daughter's face and saw something there that hadn't been there a year ago. Not toughness. She had always had toughness, the particular iron core variety of a child who'd had to grow it early. This was something more refined. A framework, maybe. A way of understanding how the world operated that was more complete than the one she'd had before Vivian came. He thought about what it meant to learn courage from someone who was demonstrably afraid and kept moving anyway. He thought about the difference between that and learning it from someone who claimed not to feel fear at all, which was either a lie or a kind of poverty he wouldn't wish on anyone. He thought his daughter was getting the better lesson. Winter deepened through January. The work contracted to the essential and the days went short and cold, but the house had a quality that it hadn't had the winter before. Occupied in a different way, fuller, the three of them moving through the space with the particular ease of people who have stopped negotiating the arrangement and simply live inside it. Vivian had taken over a corner of the parlor as her workspace, where she kept the accounts and the breeding records and the mending and the correspondence. It had accumulated the characteristic disorder of actual use, stacked papers, a jar of pens, a coffee cup that migrated in and out depending on the day, and it looked, Silas thought, exactly like the corner of a room that belonged to someone. She wrote to the families of the stagecoach passengers who had died. He watched her draft those letters over the course of several evenings, working and revising in a way she didn't do with ordinary correspondence. And when he asked if she needed anything, she said no. And when she finished, she sealed them and set them aside and didn't talk about it. And he understood that some things you did alone and then put down. She had also written twice to the traveling merchant who'd survived the crash with his broken arm, a man named Caswell, who was recovering in Millsford. The first letter was brief and careful, asking how he was, closing the loop on a shared experience. The second was longer, Caswell had written back, and Vivian read his reply at breakfast with the reading expression she had, the particular attentiveness of someone who reads everything as if it might contain something worth keeping. He says he's healed well, she told Silas. He's going on to Oregon in the spring. Good. He asked how I was. She set the letter down. He said he'd heard I survived the canyon. He said... She paused, something in her face moving. He said he thought about it, those first few days, the not knowing. He said he was glad. Are you going to write back?
Yes. She picked up the letter again. He knew the driver's name, Thomas Aldgate. He'd talked to him on the route before the crash. She folded the letter carefully. I'm glad to have the name. She'd already written to Aldgate's family by then, but she wrote again with the name confirmed, and that was the last letter in that particular thread, and she filed it with the others, and that chapter closed in the quiet way things close when you've attended to them properly.
The writing lessons started in February, when the worst of the cold had passed, and the horses had been confined long enough to need the exercise as much as she did. He had expected it to be slow. The left hip was a real concern. The same injury that had given her the limp affected how weight distributed in the saddle, and he'd spent some time thinking through how to modify the approach before she ever got on a horse. He'd also expected her to fight him on the pace, to push past what her body was telling her, because she pushed past everything. What he hadn't expected was how quickly she read the horse. She had the gray mare's trust already from her months of barn visits, and that helped, but it was more than that. She sat the saddle with the particular quality of attention he'd seen her bring to everything she learned, complete, unsentimental, interested in what was actually there rather than in what should be there. And the mare responded to it. By the third lesson, she was walking the perimeter of the east pasture unassisted. By the fifth, she was trotting, the left hip absorbing the gait with a discipline that was clearly costing her but that she didn't report unless he asked directly. He asked directly. It hurts, she said, pulling up beside him. But it's the kind of hurt that means something's being used, not broken. There's a difference. You're sure? I'm sure. She looked out over the pasture. The February light was low and pale, the grass still brown but with the first suggestion of something underneath it, the beginning of the change that would come in a few weeks. I want to be able to work the south fence line by spring, alone, not just alongside someone. That's ambitious. I'm an ambitious person, she said, without irony or pride, just fact. He looked at her on horseback against the winter pasture and thought about the woman who had arrived on his kitchen table 8 months ago, and about the distance between that and this, and about what it takes to cross a distance like that, not just physically, but in every other way, the internal geography of becoming someone who belongs somewhere. He thought that most people never made that crossing, even when nothing had tried to stop them. What? Spring came the way it always did in this part of Wyoming, not gently, but decisively, the snow retreating fast once it started, the creek running high, the grass coming in almost faster than you could track it day to day. The east meadow came back in its particular way, the native grass mix filling in from the root mass that had been quietly waiting all winter, the color returning to it in a wave from east to west as the sun came around. Vivian saw it from horseback. She came back from the south fence line on a Thursday morning in late March, alone, as she'd intended, the gray mare moving steadily under her, and she pulled up at the gate to the east meadow and sat there for a few minutes looking at the grass coming in. Silas was mending the water trough nearby and watched her without appearing to, the way you watch something you don't want to interrupt. She was sitting very still, not the rigid stillness of pain management or the alert stillness of someone calculating, just still, looking at the meadow. He thought about what she'd said in December, standing at this same fence. It's going to be extraordinary in spring. He thought about the fact that she'd said it in the future tense, which meant she'd already understood, even then, that she was going to be here to see it. That was its own kind of courage, he thought. Not the dramatic kind, not dragging yourself across stone or standing down a man who'd tried to define you. The quieter kind. The decision to plant yourself in a future and expect to arrive there. To say it's going to be extraordinary when the winter is still full around you. He'd met people, in his years working land, who couldn't do that. Who could only see as far as the current problem, the current season, the current hardship. They weren't weak people necessarily. Some of them were extremely capable, but they were always slightly surprised by the future, as if its arrival was an unexpected interruption. Vivian was not like that. She saw forward in time with the same clear eyes she used for everything else, and she built toward what she saw, and she didn't seem particularly surprised when it arrived. She turned the mare and came back toward him and pulled up. "The south fence is solid," she said. "The third post from the creek crossing needs replacing before summer, but it'll hold for now. I'll get to it this week." She nodded, then she looked at him for a moment. "The meadow," she said. "I saw you looking." "You were right," she said. "About it taking 3 years. The work's in the grass." She paused. "You don't see it while it's happening. You just do the work and then one day you look and it's there." He thought she wasn't entirely talking about the grass. "Usually how it goes," he said. She nodded once and turned the mare toward the barn. Sit. The conversation that he would think about the most in the years after happened on an ordinary evening in April. Maggie was in bed. The house had gone quiet with the particular settled quality of late evening, and he and Vivian were in the kitchen, she at her corner of the table with the breeding records, he with the ranch ledger, the stove warm, the lamp between them throwing equal light on both. She had been working in silence for 20 minutes when she said without preamble, "I've been thinking about the letters." He looked up. "The ones I wrote before I came," she said. "I've been thinking about who I was when I wrote them, what I knew, what I was moving toward." She set down her pen. "I told you in the first letter that I wasn't writing because I believed in fairy stories, that I was a practical woman in a practical situation." "I remember. I meant it," she said. "But I've been wondering lately whether I understood what I was being practical about." She looked at the lamp for a moment. "I thought I was being practical about survival, about finding a stable situation, about not being alone and without resources past the age of 35. She paused. "I don't think that's what I was actually doing." "What were you doing?" She was quiet for a moment, working at the honest version. "I think I was betting on myself," she said at last. "Not on the situation, not on you, even. I didn't know you yet. I was betting that I was the kind of person who could make something real out of whatever I was walking into, if the walking in was the right kind of risk." She looked at him. "I didn't have a word for that. I still called it practical because that was the language I knew. But it wasn't practical, really. It was faith in myself, which I hadn't had in a long time and didn't entirely recognize when I found it again." Suma said. He held her gaze. "I think," he said carefully, "that's the most you've ever said about yourself at one time." She looked at him. Then the corner of her mouth moved. "Don't make a thing of it," she said. "I'm not making a thing of it. You have a face on." "I don't have a face on." "You have the face you get when you're filing something away." He looked back at the ledger. "I'm just doing the accounts." She watched him for a moment with the expression that meant she was not convinced, and then went back to her records. But the lamp was warm between them, and outside the April night was soft and full of the sounds of a ranch in the quiet hours. The horses shifting, the creek running, Porter making his rounds of the yard. And neither of them said anything further, because what had been said was enough, and they both knew it. There are people who talk around things their whole lives, who use words the way you use a fence, to mark the edge of something, to show where you're not going. Vivian was not like that generally, but she had come from years of being in situations where what you actually meant was not what was safe to say, and the habit of compression was deep in her, the instinct to hold the true thing in and offer the functional version. What she'd said tonight was the true thing. He understood that. And he understood also that she had said it not because she needed to hear herself say it, but because she had decided he should know it. That was its own kind of offering, from a woman who didn't offer things without meaning to. He kept the face off his face, as instructed, but he filed it away, in the place where he kept the things about her that mattered most. Maggie turned 9 in May. She had in the past months acquired the cat from Mrs. Callahan's litter, a gray and white animal of considerable personality that she had named with the absolute seriousness of a child who takes naming seriously, Meridian, because she had looked it up in the dictionary and decided it meant the highest point, which she felt was accurate for this particular cat. Meridian did not justify the name on most occasions, being largely interested in sleeping and in climbing things that were not designed for climbing, but Maggie defended the name against all skeptics with a calm certainty that Vivian found entirely recognizable. For Maggie's birthday, Vivian made her a dress. Not a simple one. She cut it from the good blue wool she'd been saving, working it over 3 weeks in her corner of the parlor in the evenings after Maggie was in bed. The small, precise stitches of someone trained in a tailoring house, measured twice and cut once, and fitted 3 times when Maggie wasn't supposed to know it was coming. When Maggie opened the box on the morning of her birthday, she went very still in the way she went still when something mattered more than she was going to immediately let on. She held the dress up, looked at it, looked at Vivian. "You made this," she said. "I did. It fits." "I measured you when you were asleep," Vivian said. 3 times. I wasn't taking chances. Maggie looked at the dress for another long moment. Then she looked up at Vivian with the clear, direct gaze that was entirely her own. "Thank you, Mama," she said. Just that. No performance around it, no ceremony. The words sat in the kitchen the way words do when they've been earned rather than assigned, and Vivian received it the same way, without performance, without the wet eyes she was clearly managing against. Just a nod, just, "You're welcome, put it on and let's see," and Maggie went to put it on, and the morning went on around them. Silas was at the table with his coffee, watching. He thought about the white gloves, folded in Maggie's lap at the depot on the day the telegram came. He thought about the dress she'd worn to meet someone who hadn't arrived and then had arrived, eventually, in pieces, over months, assembled from letters and crutches and fever-broken nights, and one confrontation in a hotel dining room and 10,000 ordinary mornings. He thought that belonging was not a thing that arrived. It was a thing that was built, by hand, over time, the way you build anything worth having, with patience and with repetition, with the willingness to keep doing the work on the days when you couldn't yet see what it was becoming. He thought about a woman who had told him she wasn't writing because she believed in fairy stories, and about how what she'd built instead of a fairy story was something considerably more durable, something that had been tested by canyon and fever and fear and the accumulated weight of years and had not, in any essential part, given way. He drank his coffee and let the morning be what it was. Mom. She rode the full south fence line by herself for the first time on a Wednesday in late May, and he didn't know about it until she came back. He was in the barn when she rode in, unsaddled the mare with the practiced efficiencies she'd developed, and walked to where he was working with the even, unhurried gait that was entirely her own. That characteristic hitch on the left side, the drop and recovery. The stride that had been rebuilt from nothing over 8 months of refusal to accept a smaller version of herself. "Done," she said. He straightened and looked at her. She was flushed from the ride, her hair half out of its pin from the wind, a streak of dust on her cheek. She looked nothing like the woman in the letter photograph that Maggie had kept on her wall. She looked better. She looked like herself. "How was it?" he said. "The third post by the creek needs replacing. I told you that in February." "I replaced it last week." She paused. "Oh." A beat. "Good." Then, because she was not a woman who left things half-said when the whole thing needed saying, "It was good. The ride." She held his eyes. "It was very good." He nodded. She went to put the saddle away, and he went back to what he'd been doing, and that was that, and it was enough. And they both knew it. There's a thing that people say about survival, that it changes you, that you come through hard things different from how you went in. This is true as far as it goes, but it is not the whole truth, and the part that gets left out is more important than the part that gets said. What survival actually does, if you let it, is clarify you. Not change. Clarify. Burn off the parts that were borrowed, the parts you were wearing because they fit the situation rather than because they were yours. What's left after that is not a new person. It's a more complete version of the one who was always there underneath. Vivian Mercer had been a particular kind of person long before she wrote the first letter or stepped onto a stagecoach in Cheyenne. She had been precise and direct and unsentimental about surfaces while caring deeply about substance. She had been someone who made promises and kept them past the point of reasonable expectation. She had been someone who bet on herself in a language she hadn't had words for yet. The canyon and the fever and the long, slow months of rebuilding didn't create those things. They revealed them. Under conditions that would have let a different person become a different version of themselves, smaller, more defended, more willing to trade the essential for the safe, she had remained stubbornly and entirely herself. That, in the end, was the thing. Not the drama of it, not the miles or the broken bones or the confrontation in the hotel dining room. The thing was the consistency, the refusal to be edited by circumstance into something more manageable. There are people who survive things and spend the rest of their lives being defined by what happened to them. There are people who survive things and spend the rest of their lives pretending it didn't. And then there are people who come through and integrate what they went through into who they already were, and keep going as a more complete version of themselves. Vivian was the third kind. She always had been. She had just needed the situation that would make it visible. Summer settled over the ranch the way it did, with purpose, with heat, with the relentless productivity of a working season that doesn't pause to ask if you're ready for it. The East Meadow was everything she'd said it would be. The native grass mix came in thick and varied. The kind of growth that said the roots were deep and the soil was right. The kind that would hold through dry summers and hard winters for years to come. That had been built to last because someone had spent 3 years doing the unglamorous work of building it. Vivian rode through it one morning in June, the gray mare picking her way through the grass that reached halfway up her legs. Silas was on the far side of the meadow, checking the creek crossing, and he looked up and saw her moving through the grass in the early light, sitting the horse with the natural ease that had come to her over months, and he stood still and let himself look at it for a moment. He was not a sentimental man, generally. He was practical in the same way she was practical, because the land required it, because there wasn't room for the alternative when there was work to be done. But there were moments sometimes when the world arranged itself into something so plainly what it was supposed to be that even a practical man had to stop and acknowledge it. This was one of those moments. He went back to the creek crossing. She rode across the meadow. They met at the south gate and rode back to the barn together, talking about the fence schedule and the upcoming cattle sale, and whether the gray mare was ready to be bred this season, and the conversation was entirely functional and entirely ordinary, and it was exactly what a life looks like from the inside when it's working. Not dramatic, not fairy tale, just real, just theirs. Built piece by piece out of the materials that were available and the will to keep building. Maggie came home from school on a Tuesday in late June with a piece of paper in her hand that she set on the kitchen table in front of Vivian without explanation. Vivian picked it up. It was a writing assignment. The teacher had asked the students to write about someone they admired. The paper was Maggie's in her careful, slightly too large handwriting, and it was about Vivian. Not about the canyon specifically, or the fever, or the crutches, or any of the concrete events. Those things were there, but they weren't the center of it. What Maggie had written about, in the simple, direct language of a 9-year-old who had not yet learned to obscure the things she meant, was the consistency. She wrote that Vivian was the same person in hard moments as in easy ones. She wrote that she said what she meant and did what she said. She wrote that she had been scared of things and done them anyway, and told the truth about being scared, which was more useful than pretending not to be. She wrote, "I want to be like that when I grow up. Not exactly like her because she is her own person, but the part where she doesn't let hard things make her into someone different from who she already is." Vivian read it twice, then she set it down on the table. "Your teacher gave you a grade?" she asked. "Top marks," Maggie said. She was watching Vivian's face with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. "Is that okay, that I wrote about you?" Vivian looked at her for a moment. "More than okay," she said. She put her hand briefly over Maggie's on the table. There and gone. The quick press that was more than a formal touch and less than performance. The way she was always most honest in the small gestures. Much more than okay. Maggie looked satisfied in the contained way she had, filed it under concluded, and went to change out of her school clothes. Silas came in from the yard to find Vivian still at the table, the paper in front of her, looking at it. She heard him come in and didn't look up immediately. "She wrote about you," he said, because he'd seen Maggie come in and he'd seen the paper in her hand. "Yes." "What did she say?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she folded the paper carefully and held it in both hands. "She said," Vivian said slowly, That she wants to be someone who doesn't let hard things make her into someone different from who she already is. She looked up. Her eyes were bright, but her voice was level in the way she always managed, feeling the thing but not performed by it. 9 years old. She's been paying attention, Silas said. I know. A pause. I just want to be worth the attention. He looked at his wife across the kitchen table, at the woman who had dragged herself across a canyon floor to keep a promise to strangers, who had taught herself the accounts and the breeding records and the south fence line and the gray mare, who had stood in a hotel dining room shaking and had not shown the shaking, who had said, I decided in the fever dark, and had made it mean something, who made dinner and mended clothes and asked questions no one expected and told the truth to a 9-year-old about being afraid. Vivian, he said, you're worth more than the attention. She looked at him for a moment, that long, checking look she had. Then she set the paper down on top of the breeding records and picked up her pen. The accounting for the cattle sale, she said. Come look at this. I think you've been undercharging Greer for the hay. He came and looked. She was right. She was about most things right. He pulled up a chair and they worked through the numbers together in the late afternoon light, the kitchen warm around them. The paper with Maggie's handwriting sitting on the corner of the table where it would stay for the rest of the week before being moved to the parlor and eventually to Vivian's corner of the workspace, where it would remain. Outside, the ranch went on in the way ranches do. The horses in the pasture, the grass in the meadow, the creek and its banks, all of it requiring attention and giving back something in return for the attention given. The long, ongoing negotiation between people and land that has no final settlement, only the daily choice to keep showing up. The light through the window was the long light of a June evening, coming in level and warm, and it lay across the table and across the paper and across the two of them bent over the numbers. And it did what light does in the late hour, made ordinary things visible, made the shape of the day clear, let you see, if you were paying attention, exactly what you had built. It wasn't a fairy story. It was better than that. It was a Tuesday evening in Wyoming, and dinner needed making, and the south fence had a post that held, and a 9-year-old was somewhere in the house deciding what to name the cat's favorite sleeping spot with the same seriousness she gave everything, and a woman who had been told she was no one from nowhere with nothing was doing the accounts at her own kitchen table on her own ranch with her own family around her, and she was, in every way that mattered, exactly where she had decided to be. That was all. That was everything. That was enough.